They said fame would heal the scars, but for some stars, Hollywood was just another form of escape. When the lights go down, what secrets do the legends of the silver screen leave in the shadows? Tonight, we're pulling back the velvet curtain to reveal the harrowing journeys of icons who ran from homes that nearly broke them. Which legendary faces hid their pain behind the glamour, and what did it really cost them to survive? You might never see them the same way again. Judy Garland. For millions, Judy Garland was the radiant voice behind Over the Rainbow and the eternal Dorothy Gale. But behind the camera, her world was a maze of torment and survival. Garland's journey from a small-town vaudeville act to the peaks of MGM stardom is often celebrated as a classic Hollywood fairy tale. But the reality was a relentless nightmare shaped by betrayal, abuse, and the crushing demands of the adults around her, starting at home. Born Frances Ethel Gum in 1922, Judy grew up on the road, performing with her older sisters in a traveling troupe run by her ambitious mother, Ethel. Early on, Ethel Gum was described by those who knew her as unyielding, calculating, and emotionally distant. She wanted a star in the family, and Judy, with her remarkable voice, became her vessel for escape. There was never a childhood for Judy Garland. Instead, there were late-night performances, endless rehearsals, and constant travel. As Garland herself would later recall, her mother administered pills to keep her awake for late shows and sleeping pills to force her into rest, a habit that would become her lifelong curse. "My mother was the real Wicked Witch of the West, even though she looked like a nice little housewife," Garland once said in a moment of raw candor. The line was not a joke, but a scar. By the time Judy arrived in Hollywood, she was already used to adult cruelty. At just 13, MGM executives fixated on her appearance, calling her chubby and ugly, and forced her onto starvation diets. But it was her mother who remained the shadow behind the scenes, enforcing the studio's brutal regimen. Garland's home life became indistinguishable from her studio life, a regime of exploitation, physical and emotional manipulation, and the constant, sharp edge of her mother's disappointment. Even moments of triumph were poisoned. Ethel Gum never hesitated to remind her daughter that she owed everything to her mother's vision. Garland's first taste of rebellion was escaping her mother's physical presence. At 18, after years of forced labor and constant humiliation, she made a painful break, seeking protection in her own marriage and in the few friendships she was allowed to have. But the legacy of her mother's control, her addiction to pills, her sense of being unworthy, and the anxiety that haunted her every move followed her until her final days. The image of Garland, smiling on camera, was always in stark contrast to her private anguish. As she climbed higher in Hollywood, her childhood's ghosts only pressed in harder, driving her toward the very edge she'd spent a lifetime trying to escape. Judy Garland's story is more than a tale of stardom. It's a haunting reminder that for some classic Hollywood icons, home was the place they most desperately needed to flee. Her songs endure, but so does the echo of a young girl running as far as she could from her mother and the industry that nearly destroyed her, Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford, the woman whose name would become synonymous with Hollywood ambition and glamour, spent her childhood running from shadows, both real and imagined. Born Lucille Fay Lisieux in 1905, Crawford's earliest years unfolded in the kind of environment that could crush a child's spirit. Her father abandoned the family when she was an infant, leaving her mother, Anna, to fend for herself. Anna remarried, but Crawford's stepfather, Henry Casson, was a brooding, violent man with a temper that flared unpredictably. Joan endured frequent physical abuse and emotional humiliation, growing up in a household where love was transactional and security was non-existent. Crawford's mother, desperate and bitter from her own disappointments, offered little comfort. She was often distant, cold, and more interested in her own well-being than her daughter's. When Anna discovered that Henry was fixated on young Lucille, she shipped her daughter off to boarding schools, one after another, supposedly for her own safety, but more likely to escape responsibility. These institutions, some bordering on orphanages, were harsh, loveless places. Crawford was often put to work in the laundry or kitchens, scrubbing floors and enduring the petty cruelties of staff and older girls alike. For a time, she was simply a face in the crowd, lost and unprotected. Joan's escape came through relentless drive and a willpower that seemed forged in hardship. By her teens, she was working as a dancer in low-rent clubs, hiding bruises and scars behind a mask of performance. She reinvented herself in each new city, Kansas City, Chicago, Detroit, until she found her way to Hollywood. What the public saw was the creation of Joan Crawford, perfectly coiffed, icy, imperious, unbreakable. But the armor was forged from necessity. Crawford's relationships were marked by an intense need for control over herself, her image, and those around her, a dynamic that mirrored the unpredictable terror of her early home life. For years, Joan rarely spoke of her childhood, but those closest to her would later recall flashes of pain and bitterness that never fully healed. Her discipline, her almost obsessive perfectionism, and even her fraught relationships with her own children were all haunted by the specter of the abuse and neglect she fled. Hollywood gave Crawford the power and validation she never had as a child, but the price was living with scars that never faded. In the glow of Klieg lights and Oscar gold, the truth was always just beneath the surface. The most formidable woman on screen was, in many ways, still that wounded little girl, running from a home that had never been safe. Rita Hworth. Rita Hayworth's rise from troubled obscurity to the heights of Hollywood legend was shadowed by secrets she would spend her life trying to outrun. Born Margarita Carmen Cancino in 1918, to Spanish dancer Eduardo Cancino Sr. and Ziegfeld girl Volga Hworth, Rita's early home was a stage, both literally and metaphorically. From childhood, she was her father's partner in dance, performing in seedy nightclubs and theaters long before she was old enough to understand the dangers of the adult world around her. Behind the bright lights, the truth was far more sinister. Eduardo Cancino was not just demanding and controlling. He was, by all credible biographical accounts, emotionally and physically abusive. He treated his daughter as both a possession and a product, forcing her into backbreaking performances and isolating her from her peers. There were darker whispers too. Rumors, all but confirmed by Hayworth's own later admissions and the testimonies of family friends, that the abuse crossed every imaginable boundary. Rita's childhood was stolen. Her only escape was to keep moving, keep performing, and eventually to reinvent herself entirely. The move to Hollywood should have been a new beginning. Instead, it was more of the same. Eduardo followed her west, inserting himself into every contract negotiation and choreographing her earliest film appearances. But Rita's beauty and undeniable talent soon attracted the attention of studio executives who saw in her a malleable asset. They changed her name, dyed her hair, and launched her as Rita Hworth, the love goddess of the silver screen. With every new transformation, Rita tried to bury the wounds of her past, but the emotional scars shaped every relationship she had. Hayworth's adult life bore the marks of her upbringing: tumultuous marriages, crippling anxiety, and a desperate, lifelong quest for approval. She once admitted, "Men fell in love with Gilda, but they woke up with me," acknowledging that her on-screen persona was a mask, one she wore to survive a world that had hurt her from the beginning. Even at the height of her fame, Rita struggled to trust, to settle, to find peace in her own skin. The trauma her father inflicted never left her. It colored her world, drove her choices, and haunted her until her final years. Rita Hayworth's escape was both a triumph and a tragedy, a testament to resilience, but also a cautionary tale about the wounds that never truly heal. Hollywood made her a goddess, but it was survival that made her unforgettable. Charlie Chaplan. Charlie Chaplin's comedic genius brought laughter to the world, but his own childhood was a grim stage of deprivation and despair. Born in 1889 in London to music hall performers, Chaplin's earliest memories were not of applause and footlights, but of hunger, loneliness, and the bitter chill of neglect. His father, Charles Chaplan Sr., was an alcoholic who drifted in and out of his son's life, offering little but disappointment. His mother, Hannah, struggled with mental illness that steadily grew worse, leaving young Charlie and his half-brother Sidney fending for themselves on the ragged streets of Victorian London. Life at home was a constant crisis. There was never enough food, and as Hannah's mind unraveled, the boys would often return to find her lost in delusions or unable to get out of bed. With their father absent and their mother incapacitated, they were forced into workhouses, Victorian institutions that were more prison than sanctuary. The grim, institutionalized life meant days spent in silence, separated from one another, and treated more as numbers than children. Chaplan later recalled the indignity and terror of these places, describing nights spent crying in loneliness and confusion, his only comfort, the hope that someday things would change. For Chaplan, escape came in the form of performance, a world where laughter could override hunger, and the approval of strangers replaced the affection he never received at home. As a child, he began performing on stage, relying on his wits and natural charisma to survive. The stage was his only constant, a refuge from the unpredictable violence and emotional neglect of his real life. His mother's eventual institutionalization and his father's death from alcoholism when Charlie was only 12 left him utterly alone. But he never stopped moving forward, never stopped chasing the fleeting security that had eluded him as a boy. Chaplan's arrival in America was more than a career move. It was a desperate bid for freedom. Hollywood, for all its cruelty, offered him the power to shape his own fate. But the scars of his childhood lingered, in his obsessive work ethic, his fear of abandonment, and his relentless drive to control every aspect of his films and public persona. The Little Tramp, his most iconic creation, embodied the resilience, humor, and pathos Chaplan had developed in his own battle for survival. Off-screen, he remained wary, often aloof, and deeply protective of his privacy. Charlie Chaplin's journey from the workhouses of London to the pinnacle of Hollywood fame was a testament to survival against all odds. His comedy came from pain, his genius from a need to transform suffering into something the world could love. Yet beneath the laughter was a boy who had run, again and again, from a home that gave him nothing but reasons to escape. Marilyn Monroe. The story of Marilyn Monroe is a portrait of luminous beauty, fragile spirit, and a desperate search for love that began in the ruins of a shattered childhood. Born Norma Jean Mortensen in 1926, Monroe's earliest years were marked by instability and heartache. Her mother, Gladys, was plagued by severe mental illness, and her father, whose identity is still disputed, was absent from the very beginning. Monroe's first home was not with family, but in a series of foster homes and orphanages scattered across Los Angeles, each one colder and more indifferent than the last. Abuse in Monroe's childhood was not merely emotional, it was physical and at times terrifyingly predatory. At just 8 years old, Norma Jean was sexually abused by a boarder in one foster home. When she tried to speak up, she was punished, not protected. Her early life was a relentless cycle of fear and abandonment, with Monroe often retreating into fantasy to survive. She later confessed that she would spend hours imagining herself as a movie star, a magical existence that would deliver her from the horrors of her real world. Monroe's escape from her abusive environment came out of necessity, not hope. At 16, facing the prospect of being sent back to an orphanage when her current foster family moved away, she married her neighbor Jim Dougherty, her only legal path to avoid returning to the system. Marriage was her first act of autonomy, but it was also a continuation of survival, not love. Hollywood offered the first true opportunity for transformation. As she posed for photographers and landed small modeling gigs, Norma Jean carefully crafted the persona that would become Marilyn Monroe, blonde, effervescent, desirable, and, most importantly, untouchable. Yet, the wounds from her childhood never truly faded. Monroe's adult relationships were marked by insecurity, a craving for affection, and a fear of abandonment so deep it shaped every choice she made. Friends and lovers described her as both radiant and deeply troubled, capable of captivating a room, yet haunted by the shadows of her past. Monroe often said, "I wasn't used to being happy, so it wasn't something I ever took for granted." Her meteoric rise to fame could not protect her from the pain she carried. Monroe's tragic death at just 36, officially ruled as a probable suicide, left the world mourning the loss of an icon. But beneath the legend was always a vulnerable woman who had spent her life running from foster homes, from abusers, and most of all, from the memories of a childhood that never let her go. Carrie Grant. Carrie Grant's suave, unflappable on-screen presence remains one of Hollywood's most enduring images. But the man born Archibald Alexander Leach was forged in a crucible of heartbreak, loss, and emotional abandonment that would haunt him for a lifetime. Grant's childhood in Bristol, England was anything but golden. His father, Elias, was distant and emotionally unavailable, but the true heartbreak of Grant's early life centered around his beloved mother, Elsie. When Grant was just 9 years old, Elsie suddenly vanished from his life. One day she was there, his primary comfort in the heart of his small world, and the next, she was gone without a word. The truth, which would not be revealed to him until decades later, was that Elias had committed Elsie to a mental institution after her own struggles with depression and grief. Unable to cope with the loss of another child, Carrie's older brother John had died in infancy. Elsie's mental health deteriorated. Rather than explain, Elias simply told young Archie that his mother had gone away and left him. The wound this abandonment created was profound, leaving Grant emotionally adrift and always searching for the stability he never found at home. The aftermath was a lonely, unsettled existence. Grant's father quickly remarried, pushing his son further to the margins. Archie found solace on the streets, in the theater, and eventually, among the acrobats and performers of a vaudeville troupe he joined at age 13. The stage was his refuge, a place where he could become anyone but himself, and where applause offered a fleeting substitute for the love and reassurance he had lost. Traveling with the troupe across England and later to America, young Archie became Carrie Grant, shedding his old identity along with the pain of his childhood, at least on the surface, but the scars never fully faded. In his personal life, Grant was famously guarded, even secretive, and had difficulty forming lasting intimate bonds. He would go on to have multiple marriages, often ending them abruptly, or retreating emotionally when relationships became too vulnerable. Friends and biographers have noted how the insecurity and longing of his youth echoed throughout his adult life, fueling his relentless work ethic and his need to control his public persona. It was only in his 30s, already a Hollywood star, that Grant finally learned the truth about his mother's fate. He was able to reunite with Elsie and support her for the rest of her life, but the damage done by years of deception and abandonment could never be completely undone. Carrie Grant's transformation from Archie Leach, the neglected boy, to the epitome of movie sophistication was a remarkable escape, but also a lifelong struggle to outrun the shadows of a home that had failed him. Jean Harlo. Jean Harlo, the original blonde bombshell and one of the most electrifying presences of pre-code Hollywood, grew up in a world where parental devotion was a double-edged sword. Born Harlean Harlo Carpenter in Kansas City in 1911, she was thrust into a life shaped by her mother, Jean Bello, a woman whose ambitions for her daughter would ultimately become both a blessing and a source of deep emotional trauma. The elder Jean, often called Mama Jean, was as domineering as she was obsessed with living vicariously through her only child. From the beginning, Harlo's sense of self was subsumed by her mother's relentless drive. The family's early years were unsettled. After divorcing Harlo's father when her daughter was a toddler, Mama Jean dedicated herself to molding Harlan into a star. This meant moving frequently, isolating her from other relatives, especially Harlo's father, who had little to no presence in her life, and carefully controlling her every move. Mama Jean's ambitions knew no boundaries. When Harlan eloped at 16 with a young businessman, her mother intervened, eventually drawing her daughter back into her own orbit after the marriage fell apart. Hollywood became both an escape and a new form of captivity. Mama Jean followed Harleen to Los Angeles, managing every aspect of her budding career. She dictated Harlo's roles, public image, and even her personal life, ensuring that her daughter's fame never outshone her own sense of importance. The emotional toll was immense. Harlo's closest friends often remarked on the suffocating nature of the relationship, with Harlo unable to make decisions independently or experience normal romantic love. At times, Mama Jean's behavior veered into emotional abuse, using guilt, manipulation, and even threats of disownment to keep her daughter compliant. Beneath the platinum hair and dazzling smile, Harlo was deeply vulnerable. She longed for affection and autonomy, but found herself locked in a dynamic where her mother's approval was conditional and her privacy non-existent. The pressure to perform, both on and off screen, left Harlo battling anxiety, depression, and physical exhaustion. Despite her immense fame, she remained a lonely figure, her closest confidant, her mother, who was also her jailer. Tragically, Harlo's life was cut short at 26 by kidney failure. Even in her final days, it was Mama Jean who dictated her care and guarded her bedside, reinforcing the lifelong pattern of control. Jean Harlo's legacy is that of a radiant star whose brilliance was shadowed by the possessiveness and emotional manipulation of the person she could never truly escape. Her story stands as a reminder that sometimes the greatest need for escape isn't from Hollywood itself, but from those who claim to love us most. Dorothy Dandridge. Dorothy Dandridge's beauty, talent, and pioneering spirit left an indelible mark on Hollywood, but her path to stardom was carved through hardship and pain, much of it rooted in her own home. Born in Cleveland, Ohio in 1922, Dorothy's earliest years were dominated by the iron will of her mother, Ruby Dandridge. A frustrated performer herself, Ruby saw her daughters as the means to fulfill her own thwarted ambitions. From the moment Dorothy could walk, Ruby, alongside her partner Geneva Williams, pushed the girls into vaudeville, creating the Wonder Children Act, a childhood spent traveling, performing, and enduring a regime of discipline that was often brutal. Geneva Williams, who lived with the family and helped manage the act, was particularly feared. Accounts from Dandridge and those close to her describe Williams as physically abusive, using harsh beatings and emotional manipulation to enforce obedience. Dorothy and her sister Vivian lived in constant fear, never sure when the next punishment would fall. The girls' lives revolved around endless rehearsals and travel, with little time for friends, education, or any semblance of a normal childhood. Dorothy's later reflections describe these years as suffocating, the pressures of perfection and fear of failure becoming part of her emotional fabric. As she grew older, Dandridge's world expanded, but the scars of her upbringing remained. Hollywood, with all its barriers and prejudices, was in some ways a relief from the daily terrors of her childhood home. But it brought its own cruelties. Dorothy found herself in a landscape where racial bias dictated her roles, and the sense of being an outsider, so familiar from her earliest years, persisted. Yet she also found strength in her struggle, channeling her pain into performances marked by their emotional depth and vulnerability. Dandridge's adult relationships bore the imprint of her turbulent childhood. She gravitated toward men who were controlling or abusive, repeating old patterns even as she sought to escape them. Friends would later recall how Dorothy never truly believed she was worthy of love or happiness, the echo of her mother's and William's harsh words lingering long after she had left their household. The need for approval and the dread of failure that had defined her upbringing followed her throughout her career. Dorothy Dandridge broke barriers as the first Black woman nominated for a Best Actress Oscar, but the cost of her success was immense. Her life was a continuous act of escape, first from the abuses of her own home and then from an industry just as unforgiving. Even in her greatest triumphs, Dandridge was running, chasing the peace that had been denied her since childhood. Her legacy remains not only in her artistry, but also in her courage to flee a world that never gave her safety. Natalie Wood. Natalie Wood's innocent, luminous presence on screen captivated audiences, but the world she escaped to as a child was a far cry from the one she left behind at home. Born Natalia Nikolaevna Zakharenko in 1938 to Russian immigrant parents in San Francisco, Wood's early life was shaped by the towering and at times terrifying force of her mother, Maria. Maria Gurdon was driven, superstitious, and obsessively determined to make her daughter a star, no matter the emotional cost. From the very start, Maria's love was conditional, based on Natalie's performance and success. She subjected her daughter to emotional manipulation, using threats, guilt, and intimidation as tools to keep her compliant. Tales from Wood's childhood are filled with accounts of Maria pushing Natalie into acting roles, even when the little girl was frightened or ill. One of the most chilling stories involves Maria, desperate to evoke genuine tears from her daughter for a scene, threatening to kill Natalie's beloved pet, or convincing her that her father would be hurt if she failed to deliver. These psychological games left deep wounds, turning Natalie into a perfectionist and instilling in her a near-constant state of anxiety. As Wood's fame grew, Maria's control only tightened. Natalie's friendships and even romantic interests were subject to her mother's approval or manipulation. Maria monitored every aspect of her daughter's life, sometimes resorting to eavesdropping or spreading rumors to keep Natalie isolated and dependent. The emotional suffocation became so intense that as soon as she legally could, Wood sought emancipation. At 18, she finally broke away, but the scars from years of emotional abuse never fully faded. In her adult life, Natalie continued to struggle with self-doubt and insecurity. She was drawn to relationships that echoed the emotional turbulence of her childhood and was said to be deeply sensitive to criticism or rejection. Despite her fame, she never quite escaped the sense of being controlled by others, by Hollywood, or by the ghosts of her past. Yet, Natalie also demonstrated a quiet, determined resilience, channeling her experiences into memorable performances that resonated with vulnerability and authenticity. Natalie Wood's story is both cautionary and inspiring, a tale of a girl who ran from an emotionally abusive home, fought for her own independence, and, in doing so, left an unforgettable mark on Hollywood. Even as she struggled with the shadows of her upbringing, her spirit and talent shone through, giving audiences a glimpse of the strength it takes to truly break free. Bette Davis. Bette Davis, with her piercing eyes and magnetic, uncompromising presence, became the archetype of the strong, rebellious woman in Hollywood. Yet behind the steely persona that audiences admired was a life marked by emotional deprivation, instability, and a fierce drive to escape the insecurity of her early years. Born Ruth Elizabeth Davis in 1908 in Lowell, Massachusetts, Bette's childhood was shaped by a father who vanished and a mother left to pick up the pieces, often without the means to do so. When Bette was 7, her father, Harlo Davis, abruptly abandoned the family, leaving Bette, her younger sister Bobby, and their mother, Ruthie Davis, to fend for themselves. The sense of betrayal and loss lingered, a wound that would never fully heal. Ruthie, though loving in her way, was forced to work long hours as a portrait photographer, barely scraping by. Home was not a place of warmth or comfort. It was a battleground against poverty, uncertainty, and the relentless struggle for survival. Ruthie's love often came with the sharp edge of necessity. Affection was rare, discipline was strict, and Bette quickly learned to mask her vulnerabilities behind bravado. The frequent moves, first to New York, then to various boarding schools, left Bette feeling rootless. She often spoke of the loneliness and alienation she felt as a child, cut off from the kind of steady support that allows a child to blossom. Instead, she was forced to grow up quickly, looking after her younger sister while her mother worked. This environment taught her early on that she could rely on no one but herself. Bette's escape was through ambition. The stage, and later the screen, became her sanctuary, a place where she could reinvent herself, assert control, and demand the respect she never received at home. Acting wasn't just a career, it was her lifeline. The traumas of her upbringing fueled her relentless pursuit of success and her refusal to be bullied by directors or studio bosses. She became famous for her willingness to challenge authority, a quality that, while sometimes earning her a reputation as difficult, was at heart a survival mechanism forged in childhood adversity. Her relationships throughout life reflected the legacy of her early abandonment. Bette often struggled with intimacy, choosing partners who were emotionally unavailable or volatile. Friends and colleagues noted her toughness, but also saw glimpses of the wounded, vulnerable girl she had been. In rare moments of candor, Davis admitted that the pain of her father's desertion and her family's instability left her with a need to prove herself, to never again be powerless. Bette Davis's legacy is one of transformation, a woman who took the chaos of her childhood and turned it into the fire that made her an icon. Hollywood became her true home, not because it was easy or safe, but because it was a world she conquered on her own terms, far from the shadows of the home she left behind. In Hollywood, the spotlight hides as much as it reveals. For these legends, the red carpet was more than a symbol of fame. It was a path away from pain, neglect, and abuse. Their stories remind us that behind the glamour and the accolades were survivors, each one running from a past that shaped every triumph and every heartbreak. As the credits roll, it's clear. The strength these stars found to flee their darkest beginnings is the same strength that lit up the silver screen and continues to inspire long after the applause has faded.